And are we becoming something else and what are we going to change into if this develops, as it continues to develop? And that's the question for this class, what is happening. I don't think there's any doubt, Tom, that I think you're absolutely right that this does change us. You know.
I think it's the emotional attachment we put on things, the value of emotional importance that we put on things that we experience. There's a quote in the book that we're reading, Galatea, that really stuck out to me. When Richard is describing, he's describing a romantic experience that he had with sea, and he's saying that they were sitting down talking. He said suddenly we weren't just looking at each other. It wasn't something that we were doing. It was something that was happening to us. And when you're talking about someone that is using a screen to record and experience a concert, I think that's what's happening. There's an emotional attachment to the recording it and saying, this is happening to us, like we're here. You know, and then they're recording it for that emotional value that can go back and share with other people and remember it because it's emotionally important. So when they're recording it, they're not saying, hey, look, we're doing this. They're saying this is happening to us. And I think that's why we like to record things. You know, because then we can categorize it easier for our memory and our emotional stimulus. I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean,
I don't disagree that that's part of the emotion, but we may take the photo of the sunset to remember it, and because it was an emotional, I was here with someone, it's an important time, and we'll take a photo of the sunset and remember I was there with this person and take that. But the very fact you experienced that sunset, even for part of that time you were there through a screen, has that changed your experience of what you had, what happened?
I think it kind of does, because it takes you out of the immersion of the moment, because it breaks the immersion. Because if you're sitting there, if you're out somewhere like in a field and you have no technology on you and you're just kind of basking in the moment, that's one thing. And then when you're doing that very same thing, you're like, wait, hold on, let me take my phone now. You know, so you kind of break the immersion. I think it does kind of do that. But it also allows you to capture it for a later time, so there's a trade-off. And I think the trade-off really comes down to how important is it emotionally for you. Sometimes it's more important to just, I was at a concert once and I didn't take, I took my phone out for like 10 minutes and then I was like, what am I doing? I'm at a concert, I paid money to come here, it was an hour-long drive. I was like, put my phone away, I didn't take another picture the whole night. I was like, I'm just gonna take this in. And I enjoyed it. You know what I mean? Like I caught myself doing that. What am I doing? Like,
yeah, I think I took a photo to say I was there and that's it.
And that's it.
Yeah, I'll put it away.
There's an experience to take with you. You don't have to record the whole thing and share it with them, you know. So I think there's a trade-off of the emotion.
But there comes to a point of what's the difference between experience, you know, is it the same as watching the concert on the phone isn't the same as being there? Watching it on the screen isn't the same as being there. Even watching it on a movie screen isn't the same as being there. So all these things,
I think it's best that when we see those things on screen, we kind of use it to relate to our own experience that we have or haven't had. You know, if you see a picture of someone skydiving, like your friend goes skydiving, puts it on Facebook. I've never been skydiving, so I look at that and I'm like, wow, that's cool. You know what I mean? Like I've never done it. That'd be cool to do, but I've never done it. So it's like I look at the picture and I'm like, oh, that looks exciting, but I don't internalize the feeling of it. So it's kind of like it's kind of useless picture. You know,
to me, this is tying in a lot to things we talked about when people first started to write things down. The idea of words being used to store experience and to pass an experience between people, and then or representations of pictures being used and then tying into that seems to be what you're saying when you see this image in the film.
It's an interesting comparison, but the difference is also intriguing as well, because I think typically when someone writes a memory, it's after the experience has taken place. Would you actually sit there and write your reaction to the concert at the concert, or would you rather dance?
Yeah, people will ask me things, right?
I mean, I can imagine a range of scenarios here, but
You're right.
But I do think that there are people who did write to the moment. Think about the war correspondent, Ernest Pyle or something, with his typewriter in the trenches, or the foxhole, or whatever it was that he was in. So what we have here are other things that we might consider bringing into the conversation. Something about, you mentioned memory and presence, but what is it really, what's really involved in being in an experience or having an experience? Does an experience in some way always involve a complex sort of reciprocity between presence and absence? So we may not yet have found a way to kind of adequately describe the complexity of an event, to know how when some element, like you add technology or you add a screen to that event, how that intervention or that supplemental technology would change it. But what we really need
not only change that, change you as well.
change everything, yeah, change the person having the experience. But there are more hands here, so I'm going to resist talking a lot. Yeah.
So Damien keeps asking the question, does our experience change when we have technology?
More than just the experience. Does it? That's one of the questions. Does the experience change? But does it fundamentally change it as well?
Like physically, or like me as myself, seen through the eyes of others, has that changed too? Is that reacting also?
I'm asking probably about your sense of self, which is the thing we've been talking. I'm trying to be very careful with language. The self you see, what you perceive as being yourself, who you are.
Okay.
I'm not talking about a physical change, whether it affects your eyesight, really, but, although that may change, but whether it will change, whether you are different because of this technology compared to someone 100 years ago. Whether the human race is different, whether our human experience is different, whether we are changing. You know, the actual mental models we have about who we are. And the way we see the world and what the world is. We've said a lot of times that we define ourselves through interaction. And what I'm positing here is that interaction has completely changed in the last 10 years. And so that must change who we are if we are putting forward that idea. Is that...
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. I think it's Moore's Law that's confusing me right now, that it's just exponential. How technology's changed. It's just memory or whatever, it doubles every
18 months.
Yeah, every 18 months the memory.
Computer power doubles.
Oh, computer
Yeah,
memory.
right,
My
so-
memory doesn't double.
No, I think with that, I think if you were to say the memory that we can have definitely doubles every 18 months, because if you're able to get double as much, you're able to store double as much. So I guess I would kind of make that synonymous with human intelligence. If we're able to save more, we have more. Even though we might not be using it, it's still there.
It's there on the server, right?
Yeah.
But it's not something I have as my own memory.
Yeah.
By yet, you're looking forward to a day when we can have the plans?
Sure. I think isn't that it's part of this class too, right?
It is, yeah, that's why I'm asking.
I
So
almost...
Well, what intrigued me about your reply, it's sort of something that Damien's been asking for. I think what your comment interestingly did is it didn't make the distinction that I made.
okay.
Right? I said the memory's in the server, but you were thinking of this exponential increase in memory as something that belonged to you. I think that's a.
Yeah,
If I'm hearing the difference.
that's
in
the
this-
question we're
in
asking.
this
Is it
conversation,
change?
just, I don't know if you see.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So that your sense of yourself and with the increase in memory
Mhm.
and my sense of myself are slightly different.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's great. I mean, that's
There was a question up here, the guy had his hand up at the front. So, well, you were now.
I was just going to say that, like, I understand the dependency on technology is like an issue that people worry about, but the way I see technology is it's created to fix like a deficiency we already have. So if we wanted to fix that anyway, we wouldn't have, like, if we didn't want to fix a certain thing, we wouldn't have created the technology in the first place. So what's the harm in depending on because that's why.
It's Trish's augmentation. Technology is augmenting us, and by augmenting us, it's fixing us, not making us more than we were. There's well, I'll maybe do it at the end. I don't want to introduce too many questions. There's another question.
Oh, go ahead.
One thing you should all look up online, and this one's from Philip. I finally got around to watching it. It is excellent. H+. And you've seen this? It's an online series. Each episode's about 6-7 minutes long. It's produced by Bryan Singer, the guy who did the X-Men. Very high production values. And the basic concept is we have this technology like a mobile phone that connects us to the internet, and we can do all our shopping and listen to music and browse the web, do all these things. They talk about a few years' time when there's a technology developed where they can implant just a syringe and just implant into you tiny nanobots, so it's all in your head and you connect to the internet automatically, and all that information is available through your cerebral cortex. What's the difference? How has it changed? He asks that
Would I be
question.
able to turn it on and turn it off? Or?
No, it's on all the time.
Well, that's going to be a problem.
These are the kind of this little series questions. The first episode is people arguing for and against it. Why some people think it's good, and they have like the shopping channel. People saying, "What if I want to listen to music?" Well, you know, and they have this argument for and against. A very interesting construct. Yeah, you agree, Phil? That good description.
It's an amazing series, and it's more. One of the interesting things to me is it's the easy way to describe it is as a smartphone in your head, because that's what it is to most people. But it's also, think of all medical, like your medical records, everything about you is in this chip, is in your body. So it's like instant medical. If something happens to you, I'm walking down the street and I have a heart attack, there's some signal sent to a hospital, to an ambulance. It's more than a 911 call. They know exactly what's going on inside my body when they show up.
But what we were discussing in Hypermedia today, that mobile phones over the next 2 years are going to be monitoring all your body signals and keeping up. We were talking about sensors in mobile phones today.
But what if it's
So that's
a heart
coming.
attack I'm having? What if the police are interrogating me? And they're mapping my, they have all of this way of reading my physiological responses to their questions. Isn't there let me just pose that kind of question to you. How would you feel if it's not a heart attack, but you're under investigation because you've joined some underground group that wants to promote human liberty?
I say you guys who are pushing liberty probably wouldn't have this chip in their head.
Well, I don't know. What if it's just, something you find yourself with, and then you decide you want to opt out, or you don't like the way the corporation that owns the technology is feeding you information. So that becomes sort of the,
Yeah.
so issues about, a lot of our ideas about political freedoms and political autonomy are really a result of 17th century and 18th century thought that separates the mind and the body. It's not for nothing that we didn't have the modern political revolutions that have given us modern democracies until after 1630, when Descartes had the thought, "I think, therefore I am." That thought of Descartes that we talked about a long time ago really did create this idea that all human beings are equal in the sense that we're all doubting and thinking things. But that privileges our minds over our bodies, and it gives us a kind of autonomy. So one of the things that's clearly threatened by these developments is the sense of subjectivity in self and political agency that we've inherited up to this point. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't go this route, but with these new technologies, one of the things that will have to be fundamentally rethought are the very nature of political freedom, if there is such a thing, if we want to even keep the idea of having such a thing. Maybe the idea of being free is an archaic idea that we should dispense with. I don't know. It's up to-
You're a brave man saying
It's
that.
it's up to you. Right? I'm not going to be around that long, I've been around another couple decades at best, but that's where the crunch really comes in. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much, you guys want to talk.
That's, all this discussion just reminded me, back to that idea that's been kicking around in my head. Could you say that, that what I gain, what somebody from that sort of therapy, narrative, simulation therapy, whatever the hell you want to, whatever the hell it'll eventually get called, with the effects of that as far as mental, strategy or realization or whatever, would those be quote unquote real, or are those simulations or is the result in the mind simulated as well? Like,
That is exactly Lord Brouillard's question. It's exactly his proposition that a pilot who's in a flight simulator, even if they're flying a real plane without the simulator and the technology, that experience is changed by that simulator. So you are changed, and
You couldn't even have the experience.
you couldn't even
without
have had the experience without it. So if you were to see a real spider, that would now be changed by your experience of the virtual spider. So that experience isn't real. He argues it's not real anymore. What he talks about, he uses the phrase shreds of reality, is it?
Yeah.
Rapid shreds of reality that are left, that are all mediated by these simulations. So none of us live a real life anymore. That's his problem. I'm not saying I agree with it totally. I'm saying it gives us a way to talk about it. There is others. Anthony, you've been patient.
Anthony, sorry, with my usual name, I'm
So your original question, I think the experience has changed for people, because when they whip out their phones or whatever, regardless of whatever technology it is, they're engaging a lot more in self-reflection. There's this metacognitive aspect to it. And I'm not sure that it's entirely because you want to reproduce the experience in a high fidelity. Because in the aftermath of a concert or whatever, when somebody asks you how it was, they're not interested in the reproduction of the concert, they're interested in your impression of it. And so, if you happen to take a picture of it, those are tokens which either aid your recall or help enhance the experience for them if they choose to want to have this vicarious experience. And some people who take videos, well, skydiving or whatever, it's a vicarious experience that you're living through that person who's skydiving, and you can get a rush off of that. And in some sense, it conveys some measure of experience. Because if you sit there for a week and you watch skydiving videos and you do it, you're relating that experience to everything you've seen before.
I have all VHS tapes of the bungee jumping. I've never watched them. They would take them when I did it, but it's not like you get them out. The very fact they're VHS tapes and I've never bothered to convert them and do anything else is a kind of joke. But I've never thrown them away either. Yeah, so.
If somebody asked you about that, like the experience of bungee jumping, would you be more inclined to pull one out and say, hey, look?
I'd say, here's the cover, I don't have a VHS player anymore. But you can see that I did do it.
Your transference objects? Your transference
A
objects?
transference object, yeah, that's me. That's my immortality, is that VHS tape. I just wanted to make a brief comment on that.
I think Trish, right?
Trish, go on.
You can make your comment first.
I just wanted to comment on, just be a little bit trivial, but he talked about people using the internet for self-reflection and metacognition. You've obviously never been on Twitter. So anyway, sorry, it was frivolous, but.
I guess, actually, I had my hand up before you talked, and I was pretty much going to say something similar, because I'm just thinking about what I learned in undergrad again with history, about telling stories, and how what I've kind of come up with after listening to everybody is that I don't necessarily know specifically if, if it changes you as a person, but it changes the experience as soon as you, sorry, let me get my thoughts together. Okay, in history you're taught that, no version of a story is, the exact copy of the original, obviously. So how you describe your experience, it's your interpretation. You describe it in terms of how it happened to you. So by telling it, you've kind of already, you've changed the experience because there's one real experience. And you are telling that experience through how it happened to you. And I feel like that's kind of the same with capturing it through a picture or a video or something also. So if you explain, your copy, or if you explain to me, what happened to you at this event, my interpretation of that is a copy of your memory. And so it kind of makes me think about when Heidegger was talking about how like anybody can have, like your identity can't really be described by using societal terms, like because somebody else could have taken your spot. That experience was going to happen whether you experienced it or not. But by you experiencing it and then by you sharing it, you've changed that experience from its original to begin with. Does that make sense? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it made perfect sense because I'm going to, my memory's a little fuzzy, I was on the pain meds. When we were towards the end of the Galatea 2.2 discussion, we had this discussion about something changing by the telling with Richard talking to Helen, didn't we? Anyone else remember that? I'm sure you were talking about this, or maybe it was after that interview with Richard Powers, there was something about...
That the telling changes it retroactively acts on
Yeah, I remember taking notes.
I don't remember the specific...
But there was a discussion of that,
Yeah.
that exact thing with Richard Powers and Galatea. I'm positive there was.
There are a couple ways, let's see, a number of people wanted to say something before I say something. I'm sorry.
I have a list.
And anybody else want to say something?
Well, one thing I was thinking of with what I was just saying though too, it's kind of what you've said about using the language. Like you can pretty much, you can only relay the information that you are thinking, or relay a story based on the language that you actually have available. And so all the stories that we know from history, they might not even specifically describe what happened. You can't have experienced exactly what that person experienced or how that event actually took place. You just know what their experience was through the vocabulary and through the language that they have available at the time.
Freud, this was a problem for Freud. The famous case study that he wrote that focuses in on this issue is affectionately called the Wolfman case study. It's a beautiful case study. Freud wrote a version of it, and then he went back maybe 12 or 15 years later and rewrote another version of it, because he couldn't make up his mind about how to understand what he had worked through with this patient in the course of analysis. I'll probably won't do justice to the details of the case study, but I'll try to present it for you in the way it sort of loosely shows up in Freud's text. A young man, maybe in his early 20s, shows up in Freud's office and says he's having some repetitious, somewhat self-destructive behavior. So Freud says, tell me a dream. The dream is essentially that the boy is in bed and he's looking past his feet. So he's laying on his back, looking beyond his feet to a window. And outside of the window there's a tree, and in the tree are sitting, some wolves are sitting in the tree. So Freud works with the patient, and he tries to do a lot of free association and retrieve memories that are stored, so to speak, or recalled in the dream. And he comes up with an interpretation that goes something like this, that when the boy was about 2.5 years old, he actually saw his parents making love in the next bed. They were sharing a hotel room. And the boy experienced that perception, but had no language for that. So the child had no way to access that scene, okay? But then the child acquires language and grows up and matures and starts to learn about, he grows up on a farm, starts to learn about things like reproduction and copulation, and begins to have a language for it. So what Freud thought for a long time was that the child was retroactively traumatized by the scene. Because when he finally did have language and understanding, and he could access that memory, the memory, the scene, right? And I use the word scene for a specific reason here, because Freud called this the primal scene. That empirical experience of the scene retroactively traumatizes the child. when he's 6 or 7, going through adolescence. So Freud developed a hypothesis that this scene had to really take place in memory. And then when, let me put it differently, the scene actually took place. It was somehow what we might loosely call real. And then the child only later in life can access it, okay? And then Freud said, no, what if it's a fantasy? So he comes back with a second hypothesis, and he never really decides. So is this a fantasy that's disguised, right? And then he's just traumatized by, sexuality more generally as he learns about sexuality on the farm and about his parents and things like that. So is it something that he makes up? Is it a fictional thing that he's imposing on his experience, this trauma? Or is it something that he's actually seen but wasn't able to access? So we talk about this in terms of the undecidability between the primal scene, which is empirical, and the primal fantasy, which is fictional, a narrative construct. Is that working?
Yeah, that sounds, I mean.
Then there's a person who developed an entire narrative theory around that work, that essay, and Freud's reflections on how the human organism develops more generally and beyond the pleasure principle. His name is Peter Brooks, and he wrote a book called Reading for the Plot, where he goes into, he does this analysis of the Wolfman case study. So in part, that's what we're looking at. It's something like the version of what I was talking about a couple classes back, where the problem is, do events result in the meaning? Does the scene result in the meaning, right? Or does the meaning, the fantasy, produce the events?
Okay, yeah.
It's that same sort of structure.
No, yeah, and I think that's kind of how, we kind of have memories of the Civil War, or, we weren't there, we didn't actually experience it, but from what we've read, we feel like we've had these memories of certain battles, I feel like I can kind of relate to what you're saying in the sense of I didn't actually experience that, but once I heard that story and then I, had the language to understand it, I feel like, I guess it's a fantasy that I reflect on, and it can affect you, knowing that this happened in your country, but it's not your experience, but it can still affect you. I don't
Sure,
know.
yeah. One thing to fold into this kind of conversation is the notion of intimacy or nearness. A lot of times when we look at a work of art, something in that work, we have an intimate and an experience of the nearness of the object in the work of art. So there's a kind of intimacy in that interaction between the viewer and the work. And it could be that if we think about nearness and distance, one of the things that's happening, for example, in technologies like Twitter, it brings about an immediacy. So if you're tweeting with somebody who's at the scene of the bombing in Boston yesterday, if you're like right there on the phone following somebody's tweets, the distance has collapsed, and it might feel like you're really there, right? Or you might have a more immediate reaction to it. But that immediacy also introduces certain kinds of distortions, right? So it's possible that people, let's say you have a family member that's involved in a traumatic episode like that, or like with 9/11, there were lots of cell phone exchanges going on. So you have people at some distance being traumatized by a scene that they're only experiencing in a mediated way.
Yeah.
And what we're noticing is that these technologies collapse distance, and they allow for different kinds of experiences of things that we might call intimacy. And so that's worth thinking about quite a bit, I think, that works of art and representations more generally are attempts to collapse distance. And so at the same time, if you think about the person who's at the concert, filming and really paying attention to the screen and not to the concert on stage, then in a way you might say that person's removed, even though the person's in the scene, is in the event. That person's more at more distance from the event in some way. Perhaps, yeah, cognitive. I don't know. I don't know if it's cognitive or some other thing, but there's got to be some cognitive component to it there. So we might want to think about nearness and distance, intimacy, and what would be an opposite term for intimacy, I don't know. Indifference.
But Matt and I have done some work with Lisa looking at how people look at art in virtual environments, on two-dimensional screens or in 3D, whether they have an avatar that's looking at a piece of work. So, and what we talk about is the dimensionality changing, that if you see a picture of Mona Lisa just on the screen, it fills the screen, it's the Mona Lisa. If you see a 3D art gallery with the Mona Lisa hanging on the wall and you're seeing it from the perspective of someone walking through the gallery, but you're still seeing it through the same computer screen, how does it change your interpretation of what you're seeing? So we've been doing work on that, so looking at, and then again, it's exactly these things, this idea of intimacy, we were talking about exactly this. Engagement, intimacy, distance from the object, we used very similar terms.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
and presence and immersion, just those terms alone are controversial. I mean,
Yeah.
some